Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Madam President. We have a 50-50 Senate. There are 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats. Vice President Harris provides the Democrats with the majority. The House of Representatives has a very slim Democratic majority, currently 221 to 212, with 2 vacancies. When the 117th Congress began, I think most Americans were doubtful that we'd be able to pass legislation to help them, their families, their communities, and our nation. I'm happy to report that despite the odds, the 117th Congress has been an historically productive Congress. This is not a statement I make lightly, nor did I predict this many legislative accomplishments when we began the 117th Congress in January of 2021. I knew America's doubts, but I also shared their fervent hope that Congress would somehow find a way to beat the odds. And we have, sending numerous major bills to President Biden to be signed into law. Some of our accomplishments have been genuinely bipartisan, especially the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the so-called CHIPS and Science Bill. That is gratifying because I believe that Congress, especially the Senate, is at its best when it works in a bipartisan fashion. Some of our accomplishments have been solely Democratic victories, notably the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act. I regret that we were unable to convince our Republican colleagues to join us on those bills because they advanced public policies and enjoyed broad bipartisan support among the American people. Democrats will always reach across the aisle to pass legislation that enhances our national and economic security. But we are prepared to work alone if necessary. Our most recent accomplishment is the Inflation Reduction Act. The Senate passed this legislation just before the August recess on a party line vote. That legislation will make it easier for American families to afford health insurance and help seniors with prescription drug costs. Extending the Affordable Care Act enhanced health insurance premium subsidies through 2025. Just this one provision in this bill will save medium-income Marylander families about $2,200 annually. For the tens of thousands of Marylanders on Medicare who use insulin, the Inflation Reduction Act caps their insulin costs at $35 per month. We tried to extend that cap to Americans with private insurance. Our Republican colleagues blocked this effort, but Democrats will continue working to make that a reality. For the more than 1 million Marylanders and all other Americans covered by Medicare, the Secretary of Health and Human Services finally will have the authority to negotiate lower drug prices for the Medicare program. This will help ensure that Medicare patients get the best deal possible on high-priced drugs, saving taxpayers approximately $100 billion. The health care provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act are significant, but they're only part of the bill. The legislation makes an historic investment to shift our economy from fossil fuels to clean energy. It'll help us cut our carbon emissions by 40% by 2030. The Inflation Reduction Act will lower electricity costs and emissions, will create up to 9 million good-paying jobs here in America in growing the clean energy sector. I authored a provision in the legislation to provide production tax credits to our existing fleet of nuclear power plants. They produce 20% of the nation's electricity and over 50% of its carbon-free electricity. A new analysis estimates that this legislation will lower the average household electricity bills by approximately $170 to $220 annually over the next decade. Maryland homeowners will be eligible for tax credits for residential solar, wind, geothermal, and biomass fuel improvements now through 2034. They also will be eligible for a larger tax credit for energy efficiency home improvements through 2032, as well as tax credits for purchasing a new and used clean energy vehicles that are electric vehicles. Maryland farmers will see tangible benefits from the more than $20 billion in funds included for climate-smart agricultural practices through existing Farm Bill conservation programs, including the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and Natural Resources Conservation Service technical assistance for producers. These are very valuable programs for Maryland farmers who are meeting their obligations in regards to the Chesapeake Bay program. The Inflation Reduction Act also bolsters resilience programs to help Maryland communities prepare for extreme storms and other changing climate conditions. We live in a coastal state, so Marylanders fully understand the need to address climate change, to cut greenhouse gas pollution, and protect the Chesapeake Bay. Our state and local governments will be eligible for new and expanded grant programs to improve public health, decrease pollution, increase climate resiliency, and promote environmental equity. The legislation pays for these smart investments while reducing the deficit and without raising taxes on working families and small businesses. In fact, according to the nonpartisan analysis, many working families may actually see lower taxes on a net basis over the next couple of years as a result of the legislation. The legislation and its targeted investments aimed at lowering costs for American families is only one of a string of positive accomplishments that we've been able to do in this Congress, coordinating with President Biden. Other major legislation in the 117th Congress includes the Bipartisan CHIPS and Science Act, which will make America more competitive by bringing home domestic production of semiconductors and investing in innovation and science. The bipartisan Sergeant First Class Heath Robinson honoring our promise to address Comprehensive Toxic Act, known as the PACT Act, which provides health care benefits for all generations of toxic-exposed veterans for the first time in our nation's history, and will improve access to care for all our veterans. Promises made, promises kept. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which is the first major gun safety legislation Congress has approved in decades. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, one of the biggest, most comprehensive federal commitments to repairing and modernizing our nation's infrastructure in modern history. The Keep Kids Fed Act, which the Senate passed unanimously, that extended essential funding for schools, daycare providers, and communities to ensure healthy meals for children throughout the school year and summer. And the American Rescue Plan Act, which Democrats passed in March of 2021 to provide billions of dollars in relief to help Americans recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. We have done all this, and we are reducing the deficit by $2 trillion. Let me talk a little bit about the CHIPS and Science Act. Semiconductors are crucial to nearly every sector of our economy. They're in our cars, our trucks, medical devices, 5G telecommunications equipment, and the list goes on and on and on. America created the semiconductor industry in the 1960s. We ceded global leadership in the 70s. We regained it to an extent in the 90s, but have lost it again. In 1990, the U.S. share of semiconductor manufacturing was 37%. By 2020, that share had declined to 12%. The CHIPS and Science Act gets the United States back on track with respect to domestic semiconductor manufacturing, which is crucial for our national and economic security. This is a national security issue. It provides $54 billion in grants to domestic manufacturers and another $24 billion in tax credits through the Creating Helpful Incentives to produce Semiconductors for American Fund. The substitute amendment also authorizes $102 billion over the next 5 years for the National Science Foundation, the Department of Commerce, and the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. A $52 billion increase over the Congressional Budget Office baseline. These funds will be a shot in the arm for domestic manufacturing. Here's a list of some firms that plan to use the funding to expand or establish manufacturing facilities right here in the United States. Intel and TSMC plan to build factories in Ohio and Arizona. Global Foundries wants to expand facility in upstate New York. Skywater Technology and Purdue University want to collaborate on a new $1.8 billion factory and research facility in West Lafayette, Indiana. IBM and State University of New York at Albany want to establish a semiconductor research center in Albany. And the list goes on and on and on. We are preparing for America to continue to lead in manufacturing, particularly high-tech manufacturing. I also want to highlight the science provisions in the bill. It authorizes $20 billion for the first of its kind NSF Directorate of Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships, which will accelerate domestic development of critical national and economic security technologies, such as artificial intelligence, quantum computing, advanced manufacturing, 6G communication, energy, and material science. We're going to be the leaders in these areas. We should be. $9 billion, $5 billion over CBO baseline for several National Institutes of Science and Technology initiatives and programs, including tripling the funding for the Manufacturing Extension Program, leveraging that program to create a national supply chain data bank, which will assist businesses with supplier scouting and minimize supply chain disruptions. And with NASA, the Artemis program to return Americans to the moon as a prelude to sending humans to Mars is fully authorized and funded. The science provisions in this bill also extend the International Space Station through 2030 and support balanced science portfolio, including Earth science observations and continued development of the Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope. We're the leaders in the space telescopes. I'm proud of all the work that's done in my state of Maryland and the images that we've seen from outer space. The provision codifies the Planetary Defense Coordination Office and requires NASA to continue efforts to protect Earth from asteroids and comets. In this regard, this Monday, the Double Asteroid Redirection Test, a Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab mission, will deliberately crash a probe into a moon of a double asteroid to shift its orbit. It's amazing that we can do this. We're the leaders in science, and we're making sure we're going to be the leaders in science and in space moving forward. I introduced the Cleaner, Quieter Airplanes Act in the previous Congress and again in this Congress, and I'm pleased that the CHIPS and Science Bill directs NASA to continue research in aeronautics, including the use of experimental aircraft to advance aircraft efficiency and supersonic flight. The PACT Act, in addition to providing historical relief to toxic exposed veterans, boosts claims processing, bolsters the Veterans Administration's workforce, and invests in VA healthcare facilities nationwide to ensure the agency can meet the immediate and future needs of every veteran it serves, including the 300,000 plus veterans that live in the state of Maryland. I might tell you it provides for improvements to the community health centers in Prince George and Baltimore City for our veterans. The Safer Communities Act closes loopholes that allow convicted domestic violence abusers to buy firearms legally. It boosts funding for community violence intervention and prevention initiatives, and it provides hundreds of millions of dollars in funding to improve and expand mental health care. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Package. Funding is flowing right now to improve Maryland's transit, ports, roads, and bridges, expand broadband availability, and fix our aging drinking water and wastewater system. The bill provides $17 billion in port infrastructure and waterways. Congestion in American ports was a key factor in the disruption of the global supply chain. Expanding and modernizing port infrastructure will help ensure that American manufacturers and producers can move their goods to markets around the world. The bill also invests $25 billion in our airports. Modernizing our airport infrastructure will help keep people and products moving around the country and the world. I'm particularly pleased the legislation includes $238 million for the Chesapeake Bay program. The bill also includes my bipartisan legislation to make permanent and expand the Minority Business Development Agency, which is the only federal agency dedicated to supporting minority-owned businesses. The American Rescue Plan provides tens of billions of dollars to support vaccinations and COVID-19 testing, driving down the death rate from the virus by 90%. The bill also invested in hard-hit communities and brought concrete relief to the nation at a time of great need. I was especially proud of the investments we made to help save so many small businesses throughout Maryland and the nation. From the American Rescue Plan to the Inflation Reduction Act and everything in between, these and others legislative accomplishments have helped address important needs across Maryland and our nation. At the peak of COVID-19 pandemic, over 20 million Americans had lost their jobs, and the unemployment rate rose to 14.7% in April of 2020. The number of employed Americans now exceed the pre-pandemic high, the second fastest job market recovery since 1981. The number of Americans working is at an all-time high, and the unemployment rate has dropped to half a century low of 3.5%. Since President Biden assumed office, the economy has added nearly 700,000 new manufacturing jobs. This represents the strongest manufacturing job growth since the 1950s. Manufacturing job growth in 2021 alone exceeded any other single year going back nearly 30 years. Over the past year, the construction of new manufacturing facilities in the United States has grown by an estimated 116%. In recent surveys of CEOs, 80% were either in the process of moving manufacturing operations back to the United States from China, or were considering doing just that. While the unemployment continues at historically low and gas prices are declining rapidly, we are still facing challenges. Food prices, rent, and other costs are still too high. The Federal Reserve has had to raise interest rates, which is painful for families and businesses alike. Most mainstream economists believe that we can avoid a recession and the economy will have a soft landing despite the supply chain challenges we continue to face because of COVID and Russia's war in Ukraine. This would be a truly historic accomplishment. President Kennedy said our responsibility is one of decision, for to govern is to choose. Our legislative achievements over the last 20 months demonstrate that Congress can be productive and the federal government is a powerful force for good. I hope we choose to remain on that path, Democrats and Republicans alike, because there is still so much we can do and need to do to help the American people. Madam President, I yield the floor.